July 25th, 1944. The tropical night on Guam is absolutely silent except for the sound of rustling leaves and distant ocean waves. American Marines are dug into defensive positions along a ridgeline, weapons ready, hearts pounding. They've received intelligence that's almost too good to be true. Japanese forces are planning a massive counterattack, and the Americans know exactly when and where it's coming. In just a few hours, over 800 Japanese soldiers will march straight into what military historians would later call one of the most perfectly executed ambushes of the entire Pacific War. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. The Japanese had no idea they were walking into a slaughter, none whatsoever. Before I tell you how this incredible ambush unfolded, you need to understand what was at stake on Guam in the summer of 1944. This was not just another island in the Pacific. Guam was American territory, seized by the Japanese on December 10th, 1941, just 3 days after Pearl Harbor. For the United States, losing Guam was a national humiliation. It was the first American soil to fall to the enemy. And for nearly 3 years, the Japanese had occupied it, fortified it, and turned it into a crucial link in their Pacific defense network. The island sits in the Mariana Islands chain about 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. Whoever controlled the Marianas controlled the air routes to Japan. American bombers operating from these islands could reach the Japanese homeland, and the Japanese military command knew it. That's why they poured resources into defending Guam. By July 1944, there were approximately 18,500 Japanese troops on the island, commanded by Lieutenant General Takeshi Takashina, a veteran officer who'd spent months preparing his defenses. The American plan to retake Guam was called Operation Forager, and it was massive. The 3rd Marine Division, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, and the 77th Infantry Division, totaling about 55,000 troops, were tasked with the invasion. The operation began on July 21st, 1944, with a devastating naval bombardment. American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded Japanese positions for 13 straight days before the invasion, the longest pre-invasion bombardment of the Pacific War. The noise was deafening. The destruction was total. Entire hillsides were stripped of vegetation. Japanese bunkers and fortifications were blown apart. But the Japanese were dug in deep, and they weren't going anywhere without a fight. When those Marines hit the beaches on July 21st, they expected fierce resistance, and they got it. Japanese machine gun positions opened up from hidden caves and reinforced bunkers. Mortar shells rained down on the landing craft. The Marines fought for every yard of sand, every foot of coral reef. The beaches were divided into sectors with names that would become legendary. Asen Beach, Agate Beach. Blood soaked into the white sand as Marines pushed inland against determined Japanese defenders who had been ordered to fight to the death. But the Americans had something the Japanese didn't: superior intelligence. American codebreakers had been reading Japanese communications for years. The intelligence units attached to the invasion force were intercepting and decoding Japanese radio transmissions almost in real time. They knew Japanese troop positions, supply levels, and most crucially, they knew Japanese battle plans. And in late July 1944, American intelligence intercepted something extraordinary: detailed plans for a major Japanese counterattack. Lieutenant General Takashina was planning something bold and desperate. His forces had been pushed back from the beaches. American forces were establishing a beachhead and pushing inland. Takashina knew that if the Americans consolidated their positions, the battle for Guam would be lost. He needed to hit them hard, hit them fast, and drive them back into the sea. So he planned a massive nighttime counterattack, concentrating nearly all his available forces for one devastating blow. The plan was to punch through American lines, reach the beaches, and destroy the supply dumps that were keeping the invasion force fed and armed. The Japanese called it a banzai charge, but that term doesn't do justice to what Takashina was planning. This wasn't a suicidal rush by desperate soldiers. This was a coordinated military operation involving multiple battalions, artillery support, and specific tactical objectives. Takashina assembled approximately 800 to 1,000 soldiers from various units, including elite infantry battalions, naval troops who'd been fighting as ground forces, and even some Korean laborers who'd been pressed into combat service. They were to attack on the night of July 25th, moving through the jungle under cover of darkness, hitting the American positions with overwhelming force. Here's where the story gets absolutely incredible. American intelligence didn't just know an attack was coming. They knew the exact route the Japanese would take, the approximate time of the attack, and roughly how many soldiers would be involved. Marine commanders had days to prepare, days to set up the perfect killing field, days to position machine guns, arrange artillery support, establish fields of fire, and dig their defensive positions exactly where they needed to be. The man in charge of the American defensive sector where the Japanese would attack was Colonel Edward Craig, commander of the 9th Marine Regiment. Craig was a professional officer, tough as nails, who'd been fighting in the Pacific since Guadalcanal. When he received the intelligence about the coming attack, he didn't waste a second. He gathered his battalion commanders and laid out the situation. They had advance warning of a major enemy attack, and they were going to use that advantage to its absolute fullest extent. Craig's Marines went to work. They reinforced their foxholes and trenches. They positioned Browning M1917 machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire, meaning that no matter where the Japanese attacked, they'd be caught in crossfire from multiple directions. They ranged their mortars and artillery, using the daylight hours to calculate exact distances to likely Japanese approach routes. They stockpiled ammunition, thousands upon thousands of rounds, until every fighting position had enough bullets to sustain continuous fire for hours. They set up illumination shells, flares that could turn night into day at a moment's notice. But here's what made this ambush truly devastating: the terrain. The Japanese attack route ran through a narrow valley with steep ridges on both sides. Military tacticians call this a kill box, a confined area where an attacking force can be hit from multiple angles with no room to maneuver or retreat. The Marines owned those ridges. They'd positioned their heavy weapons up high, looking down into the valley. When the Japanese came through, they'd be silhouetted against the night sky, perfect targets for Marines firing from elevated, protected positions. As July 25th dawned, the Marines waited. The day passed slowly, tension building with every hour. The Marines knew what was coming. They'd been briefed on the intelligence. But knowing an attack is coming and experiencing it are two completely different things. Young Marines, many of them teenagers who'd never been in combat before Guam, checked and rechecked their weapons. Veterans, men who'd fought on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, prepared themselves mentally for what they knew would be a night of absolute chaos and violence. The Japanese, meanwhile, were making their final preparations, completely unaware that the Americans were waiting for them. Lieutenant General Takashina moved among his troops, delivering speeches about duty, honor, and the emperor. Japanese military culture in 1944 emphasized absolute loyalty and the willingness to die for the nation. Surrender was considered the ultimate disgrace. These soldiers had been told that the Americans took no prisoners, that capture meant torture and death. They believed they were fighting for their survival and their nation's honor. Many of them wrote final letters to their families, letters they didn't expect to survive to send. Around midnight on July 25th, the Japanese forces began to move. Over 800 soldiers, moving as quietly as possible through the jungle darkness, advanced toward American lines. They carried rifles, machine guns, grenades, and swords. Some officers carried samurai swords that had been in their families for generations. They moved in multiple columns, converging on what they believed would be a vulnerable section of the American perimeter. The first American outposts detected movement around 12:30 a.m. Marines in forward-listening posts heard the unmistakable sounds of a large body of troops moving through the jungle, branches breaking, equipment rattling, whispered commands in Japanese. They immediately radioed back to the main defensive positions. The message was simple and terrifying. They're coming. Colonel Craig gave the order to hold fire. This required incredible discipline. Marines could hear the Japanese getting closer, could hear hundreds of soldiers moving through the darkness toward them, but Craig wanted to wait. He wanted the Japanese fully committed, completely in the open, with no chance to retreat or take cover. He wanted them in the kill box. The Japanese advanced with confidence. Their intelligence had told them the Americans in this sector were few in number and poorly positioned. They expected to overwhelm the defenders quickly and push through to the beaches. As they entered the valley, Japanese officers began organizing their forces for the final assault. This was the moment they'd trained for, the moment when they would drive the Americans into the sea and save Guam for the Emperor. Then, the night exploded into fire and death. On Craig's command, every American weapon opened up simultaneously. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, artillery, everything fired at once. Tracer rounds lit up the night like deadly fireworks, streams of red and orange cutting through the darkness. The sound was absolutely deafening, a continuous roar of gunfire that could be heard for miles. Illumination flares burst overhead, flooding the valley with harsh white light that turned the jungle into a nightmare landscape of stark shadows and blinding brightness. The Japanese were caught completely in the open. They'd been advancing in relatively tight formations, expecting to hit the American lines in a concentrated rush. Now they were bunched together in a confined valley with Marines firing down on them from both sides. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The American machine gunners were firing 500 rounds per minute, sweeping their fire back and forth across the valley floor. Artillery shells were exploding among the Japanese formations, sending shrapnel ripping through bodies and turning the jungle floor into a cratered moonscape. Some Japanese soldiers tried to charge forward, screaming, "Banzai!" and running directly at the American positions with bayonets fixed. They were cut down before they made it 50 yards. Others tried to retreat, to get back into the jungle and regroup, but American artillery was now falling on the approach routes, blocking any escape. Still others tried to take cover, pressing themselves into whatever depressions or ditches they could find, but the Marines had pre-registered these positions. They knew exactly where someone might hide, and they poured fire into every potential cover point. The Japanese officers tried desperately to rally their men to organize some kind of coordinated response, but it was impossible. The noise, the chaos, the sheer volume of American fire made command and control impossible. Officers who stood up to shout orders were immediately targeted and killed. Radio operators were hit before they could transmit messages. The Japanese attack, which had begun with such confidence and determination, disintegrated into a desperate struggle for survival. Marine Lieutenant William Jones, who fought in the ambush, later described it in an interview. "It was like shooting fish in a barrel, but I felt no joy in it. These were brave men, walking into certain death because their commanders had sent them. We killed them by the hundreds, and they kept coming. I've never seen such courage and such waste of life at the same time." The battle raged for over 3 hours. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers tried to break through the American lines, and wave after wave were cut down. The Marines fired until their machine gun barrels glowed red hot and had to be changed. They fired until shell casings piled up ankle deep in their fighting positions. They fired until their shoulders were bruised from rifle recoil and their ears were ringing so badly they couldn't hear commands shouted from 5 feet away. Around 3:30 a.m., the Japanese attack began to falter. There simply weren't enough soldiers left standing to continue the assault. Small groups of survivors began filtering back through the jungle, carrying wounded comrades, leaving behind the bodies of hundreds of their fellow soldiers. The Americans maintained their fire, not knowing if this was a temporary withdrawal or the end of the attack. Marine commanders weren't taking any chances. They'd seen Japanese forces regroup and attack again before. As dawn broke on July 26th, the full scale of the carnage became apparent. The valley floor was carpeted with Japanese bodies. Marines conducting battlefield assessment counted over 800 Japanese dead. The exact number has been debated by historians, with some sources citing 800, others claiming closer to 1,000, but all agree it was one of the most one-sided engagements of the Pacific War. American casualties in the ambush were remarkably light. 166 men killed or wounded, a stunning ratio given the intensity of the fighting. But the human cost wasn't just measured in numbers. Walking through that valley in the morning light, Marines found scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Young Japanese soldiers, some who looked barely 16 years old, lying dead with photographs of their families clutched in their hands. Officers who'd committed suicide rather than face the disgrace of defeat, their samurai swords lying beside their bodies. Wounded Japanese soldiers who begged to be killed rather than captured. So thoroughly had they been indoctrinated to fear American imprisonment. The ambush broke the back of Japanese resistance on Guam. Lieutenant General Takashina had gambled everything on this counterattack, and he'd lost. He'd lost not just the battle, but the bulk of his mobile combat forces. The Japanese troops remaining on Guam were now fragmented, unable to mount coordinated resistance. Takashina himself would be killed in action just 3 days later, on July 28th, shot by an American sniper while moving between defensive positions. For the American forces, the successful ambush was a turning point. It demonstrated that superior intelligence, when properly utilized, could offset the fanatical determination of Japanese defenders. It showed that American forces had learned from earlier Pacific battles, that they'd adapted their tactics, and were now fighting smarter, not just harder. The ambush also gave a huge morale boost to the Marines, proof that careful planning and discipline could defeat even the most determined enemy attack. But we need to talk about why this ambush happened in the first place, because the intelligence victory that made it possible was the result of years of dedicated work by American code breakers, many of whom never received public recognition for their contributions to the war effort. The ability to read Japanese communications didn't happen by accident. It was the product of a massive, coordinated effort that began before the United States even entered the war. In the 1930s, American cryptographers, led by men like William Friedman and his team at the Army's Signal Intelligence Service, had begun the painstaking work of breaking Japanese diplomatic and military codes. This work accelerated dramatically after Pearl Harbor, when the U.S. government poured resources into signals intelligence. By 1944, American cryptographers could read many Japanese military communications, though not all of them and not always in real time. The code-breaking operation was centered at several locations, including Arlington Hall in Virginia and various field stations across the Pacific. These weren't dramatic, action-filled places. They were offices filled with people, mostly women, working long hours hunched over intercepts, looking for patterns, testing possible code solutions, translating decoded messages. It was tedious, exhausting work that required incredible attention to detail and mathematical skill. The intelligence that led to the Guam ambush came from intercepts of Japanese radio traffic in the days leading up to July 25th. American listening posts had picked up increased radio activity from Japanese units on Guam. Cryptographers decoded the messages and realized they were looking at operational orders for a major attack. The intelligence was passed up the chain of command, analyzed, and delivered to the tactical commanders who needed it most, the Marines who would face the attack. This brings us to another crucial aspect of the story. The Japanese never knew their codes had been broken. Throughout the war, Japanese military leadership believed their communications were secure. They continued using compromised codes and ciphers, allowing Americans to read their mail, so to speak, for years. This intelligence advantage saved countless American lives and shortened the war in the Pacific by months, perhaps years. The ambush on Guam also revealed something profound about the nature of warfare in 1944. This wasn't the War of 1914, where masses of men charged across open ground into machine gun fire with no alternative. By 1944, warfare had become more technical, more dependent on intelligence, communications, and coordination. The side that could gather better intelligence, process it faster, and deliver it to commanders in the field had an enormous advantage. The Japanese military, despite its warrior culture and fighting spirit, was losing the intelligence war badly. After the ambush, American forces continued their advance across Guam. The island was declared secure on August 10, 1944, though pockets of Japanese resistance would hold out for months, and a handful of Japanese soldiers would remain hidden in the jungle, refusing to surrender until the 1970s. The conquest of Guam gave the United States a crucial base for B-29 Superfortress bombers, which would soon begin systematic bombing raids on the Japanese home islands. For the Japanese survivors of the July 25th ambush, the experience was traumatic beyond measure. Those who lived through that night of hell retreated deeper into Guam's interior, where they would continue fighting a hopeless battle. Many chose suicide over capture. Others were killed in subsequent operations. A few were taken prisoner, though prisoner of war camps in the Pacific were rare because so few Japanese soldiers were willing to surrender. One of the most remarkable aspects of this story is how it illustrates the clash of two completely different military cultures. The American military, for all its faults, valued the lives of its soldiers. American commanders used intelligence, firepower, and tactical advantages to minimize their own casualties while maximizing enemy losses. The goal was to win the war and bring as many boys home as possible. American soldiers were told their lives had value, that surrender was an option if the situation became hopeless, that survival was not shameful. The Japanese military culture of 1944 was fundamentally different. It was built on concepts of honor, duty, and sacrifice that Western observers struggled to understand. Japanese soldiers were taught that death in battle was the highest honor, that surrender brought eternal shame, not just to the soldier, but to his entire family. Officers carried swords and expected to use them, either on the enemy or on themselves if defeat became inevitable. This wasn't just propaganda, it was deeply embedded in the military culture, reinforced by years of training and indoctrination. This cultural difference made the Pacific War particularly brutal. American soldiers couldn't understand an enemy who would choose death over surrender in situations where surrender was the only rational choice. Japanese soldiers couldn't understand an enemy who valued individual survival over collective honor. The result was a war of extraordinary violence, where quarter was rarely asked for and even more rarely given. The ambush on Guam exemplified this clash. The Japanese soldiers who walked into that valley knew they might die. They'd made peace with that possibility. What they didn't know was that they were walking into a death trap prepared by an enemy who'd been reading their mail for days. The honor and courage they displayed charging into American fire was genuine and worthy of respect, even as we recognize that their deaths achieved nothing except to hasten Japan's defeat. In the aftermath of the battle, American commanders studied what had happened and incorporated the lessons into training and doctrine. The importance of intelligence was emphasized even more heavily. Commanders learned to trust their intelligence officers and to act decisively on good information. The tactics used in the ambush, particularly the use of terrain and interlocking fields of fire, became standard practice in subsequent Pacific operations. For the individual Marines who fought in the ambush, the experience was both validating and disturbing. They'd performed their duty brilliantly, killing large numbers of enemy soldiers while suffering relatively few casualties themselves. This was exactly what they had been trained to do. But many of them also felt something more complex, a mixture of triumph and horror at the sheer scale of the slaughter. These were young men, many still teenagers, who'd participated in killing hundreds of human beings in a few hours. That's not something you easily forget or move past. Marine Corporal James Mitchell, interviewed decades later, said, "We did what we had to do. We killed them before they could kill us. But I still see their faces sometimes, those Japanese soldiers charging out of the darkness. They were brave men, braver than I'll ever be, and we cut them down like wheat. I'm glad we won. I'm glad I survived. But I'm not glad about what I had to do to survive." The battle also had strategic implications beyond Guam itself. The swift conquest of the island, aided enormously by the successful ambush, allowed American forces to move forward with their plans to invade Tinian and Saipan, the other major islands in the Marianas chain. These invasions would be costly, but they would ultimately give the United States the bases needed to bring the war directly to Japan's doorstep. By late 1944, B-29 bombers operating from the Marianas were flying regular missions over Japan, dropping thousands of tons of incendiary and high explosive bombs on Japanese cities and industrial centers. The strategic bombing campaign would kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians and destroy much of Japan's war-making capacity. None of this would have been possible without the airfields built on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, and those airfields wouldn't have been built if American forces hadn't conquered those islands. So, the ambush on July the 25th, 1944, while a relatively small engagement in the grand scheme of World War II, was a crucial link in the chain of events that led to Japan's defeat. It shortened the battle for Guam, which enabled the strategic bombing campaign, which helped force Japan's surrender in August 1945. In the terrible mathematics of war, those 800 Japanese soldiers who died in the ambush may have inadvertently saved tens of thousands of lives, both American and Japanese, by helping to shorten the war. But we should also remember that those 800 men were individuals, not just numbers in a casualty report. They had names, families, dreams, and hopes. Many of them probably didn't want to be soldiers. They'd been conscripted into service, trained to obey orders without question, and sent to die on a tropical island thousands of miles from home. They fought bravely for a cause they believed in, even if that cause was ultimately unjust and doomed to fail. The same is true for the American Marines who fought in the ambush. They were ordinary young men thrust into an extraordinary situation. They'd left their homes, their families, their normal lives to fight a war. They didn't start against an enemy they didn't hate on a personal level. They performed their duty with courage and skill, and many of them paid a terrible psychological price for what they experienced in combat. War memoirs and oral histories from Pacific War veterans reveal a common theme: respect for the enemy's courage, even while fighting desperately to kill him. Marines who fought against Japanese soldiers often described them as the most formidable opponents they'd ever faced. Men who would fight to the last bullet and then charge with bayonets or swords rather than surrender. This wasn't simple fanaticism. It was a different cultural understanding of honor and duty, one that American soldiers struggled to comprehend but learned to respect. The ambush site itself is still visible on Guam today, though the jungle has long since reclaimed the land. The valley where 800 Japanese soldiers died is now peaceful, covered in dense vegetation. There are no monuments marking the spot, no plaques commemorating the battle. Most tourists who visit Guam have no idea that one of the war's most one-sided ambushes happened there. The island has moved on, rebuilt itself as an American territory and tourist destination, but the ghosts of that night in July 1944 still linger for those who know the history. Guam's indigenous Chamorro people experienced their own trauma during the war. They'd been occupied by the Japanese, who treated them harshly, using them for forced labor and punishing any resistance brutally. When American forces invaded, the Chamorros were caught in the middle of the fighting. Many were killed in the crossfire. Others were forced to hide in caves and jungle camps, unsure which side represented safety. The liberation of Guam was genuinely welcomed by most Chamorros, but the price of liberation was high. The ambush also demonstrated the limitations of courage and determination when facing superior intelligence and firepower. The Japanese soldiers who walked into that valley were undeniably brave. They were willing to fight and die for their emperor and their nation. But bravery alone couldn't overcome the fact that the Americans knew they were coming, had prepared the battlefield, and had overwhelming firepower advantage. In modern warfare, especially by 1944, intelligence and technology often mattered more than individual heroism. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of military leadership and the responsibilities of commanders. Lieutenant General Takashina ordered the attack that led to the deaths of 800 of his men. Did he know it was likely to fail? Did he have intelligence suggesting the Americans might be expecting the attack? We don't know for certain, because Takashina died 3 days later and left no memoir or detailed account of his decision-making. But we do know that by late July 1944, the strategic situation on Guam was hopeless for the Japanese. The Americans had overwhelming numerical and material superiority. They controlled the seas and skies. They could bring in reinforcements and supplies at will, while the Japanese had none coming. In that context, Takashina's decision to launch a major counterattack could be seen as either a desperate but rational attempt to change the trajectory of the battle, or as a wasteful sacrifice of his men's lives for no meaningful military gain. Military historians have debated this question for decades. Some argue that Takashina had no choice, that Japanese military doctrine and his orders from higher command left him no option but to attack. Others contend that a more defensive strategy, preserving his forces and making the Americans pay a higher price for every yard of ground, would have been more effective. What's not debatable is the outcome. The counterattack failed catastrophically. It cost the Japanese the majority of their combat-effective forces on Guam and hastened the island's fall. Whether Takashina made the right decision given the information available to him, or whether he needlessly sacrificed his men, we can't know with certainty. What we can say is that the courage of the soldiers who followed his orders deserved better intelligence and better leadership than they received. The American side also faced ethical questions about the ambush, though these are less frequently discussed. When you have advanced knowledge of an enemy attack, when you've set up what amounts to a shooting gallery, are you morally obligated to offer the enemy a chance to surrender before opening fire? The Marines on Guam never considered this question, nor should they have been expected to in the middle of a brutal war. Their job was to kill enemy soldiers and win the battle, and they did that job with devastating effectiveness. But from a distance of 80 years, we can reflect on these questions. We can acknowledge that the Japanese soldiers who died in the ambush were human beings, that their deaths, while militarily necessary from the American perspective, were still tragedies for their families and their nation. We can respect their courage while recognizing that the cause they fought for was unjust, and that their deaths ultimately served no useful purpose. The intelligence that made the ambush possible continued to shape the Pacific War's final year. American code breakers maintained their advantage over the Japanese, reading their communications, predicting their strategies, and enabling American commanders to position their forces for maximum advantage. This intelligence superiority played a crucial role in every major battle of 1944 and 1945, from the Battle of Leyte Gulf to Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Interestingly, the Japanese military never fully grasped that their codes were compromised. Even after suffering multiple defeats that should have suggested an intelligence leak, Japanese commanders attributed their losses to American numerical superiority, better equipment, or tactical skill. The possibility that the Americans were reading their most secret communications was considered but ultimately dismissed. This was partly due to overconfidence in their encryption systems, and partly due to cultural factors that made admitting such a fundamental security failure almost impossible. The psychological impact of the ambush on surviving Japanese soldiers was profound and lasting. Those who escaped the killing field and survived the remainder of the battle for Guam carried the trauma of that night for the rest of their lives. In post-war interviews and memoirs, Japanese veterans described the ambush as a descent into hell, an experience of such concentrated violence and death that it shattered their understanding of what warfare could be. One survivor, whose account was recorded by a Japanese historian in the 1980s, described seeing his entire platoon cut down in seconds, watching men he'd trained with for months torn apart by machine gun fire and artillery, and somehow surviving by playing dead among the corpses until dawn. He spent the next 2 weeks hiding in the jungle before being captured by American forces. His shame at surviving when so many had died, combined with the shame of being taken prisoner, affected him for the rest of his life. This raises another important aspect of the Pacific War that the Guam ambush illustrates: the different attitudes toward prisoners of war. American military culture held that soldiers who had fought honorably and been overwhelmed by superior force could surrender without dishonor. Being a POW wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't shameful. This allowed American soldiers to surrender when continuing to fight would mean certain death for no military gain. Japanese military culture had no such escape valve. Surrender was absolute disgrace, a betrayal of the emperor, of one's family, of one's ancestors. This meant that Japanese soldiers often fought to the death, even in hopeless situations, and it meant that those who were captured, often unconscious from wounds, faced incredible psychological trauma from the shame of survival. The contrast in POW numbers tells the story. In the entire Pacific War, American forces took relatively few Japanese prisoners, while Japanese forces captured hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. The ambush also highlighted the critical importance of night fighting in the Pacific theater. The Japanese military placed great emphasis on night operations, believing that darkness negated American advantages in firepower and air support. Japanese soldiers were trained extensively for night combat, learning to move silently through jungle terrain, to navigate by stars and landmarks, to coordinate attacks using minimal communication. Many of their most successful operations in the war's early years were night attacks that caught Allied forces off guard. By 1944, however, American forces had adapted. They'd developed better night vision equipment, more effective illumination rounds, and tactics specifically designed to counter Japanese night attacks. The ambush on Guam was a perfect example of this adaptation. The Marines didn't panic when the Japanese attacked in darkness. They'd prepared for it, expected it, and had the tools and training to fight effectively at night. The illumination flares that turned night into day were particularly important, stripping away the darkness that Japanese forces counted on for concealment. The role of artillery in the ambush deserves special mention. American artillery in World War II was extraordinarily effective, arguably the best in the world. American artillery officers were trained in sophisticated fire control techniques, using mathematics and careful observation to place shells exactly where they were needed. The Marines on Guam had pre-registered their artillery on likely Japanese approach routes, meaning they'd calculated the exact settings needed to hit those locations and could call for fire with minimal delay. When the Japanese attacked, Marine forward observers radioed coordinates to the artillery batteries positioned behind the lines. Within seconds, 105mm and 155mm howitzer shells were screaming through the air, falling among the Japanese formations with devastating accuracy. The combination of machine gun fire from the front and artillery fire from above created an inescapable kill zone. Japanese soldiers who tried to advance were shot, those who sought cover were shelled, and those who attempted to retreat ran into more artillery fire, blocking their escape routes. The psychological effect of being caught in an artillery barrage is hard to overstate. The noise alone is overwhelming, a continuous roar of explosions that makes thinking almost impossible. The ground shakes, dirt and debris rain down, and the concussive force of nearby explosions can kill without even hitting you directly. For the Japanese soldiers trapped in that valley, the artillery barrage must have seemed like the end of the world, an apocalyptic storm of fire and metal that destroyed everything it touched. American artillery doctrine emphasized massed fires, concentrating the fire of multiple batteries on a single target area to maximize destruction. During the ambush, Marine artillery fired thousands of rounds in a few hours, an enormous expenditure of ammunition that was only possible because American logistics were so good. Ships offshore could deliver more shells as needed, trucks could bring ammunition forward from supply dumps, and the entire system was designed to ensure that American gunners never ran out of ammunition in a critical moment. The Japanese had artillery too, of course, but they couldn't match American fire support in quantity or quality. Japanese artillery tended to be lighter, less numerous, and less well supplied with ammunition. Japanese artillery doctrine emphasized careful ammunition conservation because resupply was difficult or impossible. This meant that even when Japanese gunners had targets, they often couldn't fire as many shells as they wanted to, couldn't sustain long bombardments, couldn't provide the kind of overwhelming fire support that American forces took for granted. This disparity in firepower was one of the fundamental asymmetries of the Pacific War. American industry could produce vast quantities of weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies. American logistics could deliver those supplies to forces fighting on islands thousands of miles from the U.S. mainland. Japan's industry, while impressive for its size, couldn't match American production, and Japan's logistics were increasingly disrupted by American submarine warfare and air attacks. By mid-1944, Japanese forces throughout the Pacific were running short of everything: food, ammunition, medical supplies, reinforcements. The soldiers who walked into the ambush on Guam were already short on supplies, already worn down by weeks of combat and bombardment, already aware that no help was coming. They attacked anyway, because that's what their training, their culture, and their orders demanded. Their courage in attacking despite hopeless odds is worthy of respect, even as we recognize that their attack was doomed from the start, and that their deaths accomplished nothing except to slightly delay an inevitable American victory. After the battle, American forces conducted a detailed after-action review, documenting what had worked and what could be improved. These reviews were standard practice in the U.S. military, part of a systematic effort to learn from each engagement and incorporate lessons into future training and operations. The review of the Guam ambush highlighted several successes: the effective use of intelligence, the careful preparation of the battlefield, the discipline of Marines who held their fire until the Japanese were fully committed, and the devastating effectiveness of coordinated machine gun and artillery fire. But the review also noted areas for improvement. Communication between units during the height of the battle had been difficult due to the noise and chaos. Some Marines had fired at muzzle flashes that turned out to be from other American positions, though fortunately without causing casualties. The illumination rounds, while effective, had created harsh shadows that made target identification challenging. These lessons were incorporated into training programs and tactical doctrine, helping to make American forces even more effective in subsequent battles. The human cost of the ambush extended far beyond the battlefield itself. In Japan, hundreds of families received the dreaded notification that their sons, husbands, or fathers had been killed in action on Guam. The Japanese government provided few details about how these men had died, simply stating they had fallen in heroic combat for the emperor. The families had no way of knowing that their loved ones had walked into a carefully prepared trap, that they'd been cut down in a valley on a tropical island in a battle that lasted only a few hours. For decades after the war, Japanese families would make pilgrimages to Guam, searching for information about what had happened to their relatives, trying to find closure. Some brought back soil from the island to place in family shrines. Others simply stood in the jungle where the battle had occurred, paying their respects to men who died far from home in a war that destroyed their nation. These pilgrimages continue even today, as descendants of the soldiers killed in the ambush seek to honor their ancestors and understand their sacrifice. The ambush on Guam also had implications for how the American public understood the Pacific War. When news of the successful defense reached the United States, it was reported as a great victory, proof that American forces could outfight the Japanese even when attacked on ground of the enemy's choosing. The newspapers didn't mention the intelligence advantage that had made the victory possible. That information remained classified for decades. Instead, the public read stories of brave Marines standing firm against a massive enemy attack, holding their positions through hours of desperate fighting. This narrative wasn't false, exactly. The Marines had indeed been brave, and the fighting had indeed been desperate. But it was incomplete. The untold story was that of the code breakers, radio intercept operators, intelligence analysts, and commanders who turned raw intercepted communications into actionable battlefield intelligence. These people, working in offices and listening posts far from the front lines, had contributed just as much to the victory as the Marines who'd pulled the triggers. But their story couldn't be told in 1944, because doing so would have revealed to the Japanese that their codes were broken. It wasn't until after the war, when historians gained access to classified documents, that the full story of American signals intelligence in the Pacific began to emerge. Even then, many details remained classified for decades. The full extent of American code-breaking success wasn't publicly revealed until the 1970s, nearly 30 years after the war ended. By that time, many of the people who'd worked in signals intelligence had passed away, never receiving public recognition for their crucial contributions to victory. The lessons of the Guam ambush influenced American military thinking for generations. The importance of intelligence, the value of careful preparation, the effectiveness of combined arms tactics, all of these became fundamental principles of U.S. military doctrine. Modern American military forces place enormous emphasis on intelligence gathering and analysis, on using technological and informational advantages to achieve victory with minimal friendly casualties. The roots of this approach can be traced back to battles like the ambush on Guam, where superior intelligence turned what might have been a tough fight into a one-sided slaughter. The ambush also demonstrated something important about the nature of courage in warfare. The Japanese soldiers who attacked that night were undeniably courageous. They advanced into enemy fire, watched their comrades die around them, and kept moving forward because their sense of duty and honor demanded it. But courage alone wasn't enough to overcome the combination of intelligence, preparation, and firepower that the Americans brought to bear. In modern warfare, the side that fights smarter usually beats the side that fights harder, no matter how brave individual soldiers might be. This doesn't diminish the courage of those Japanese soldiers. If anything, it makes their sacrifice even more tragic. They died because their commanders sent them into a battle they couldn't win, walking into a trap they didn't know existed, fighting for objectives that were already lost. Their bravery was real, but it was wasted on a hopeless attack that accomplished nothing except to get them killed. The Marines who fought in the ambush understood this, even if they couldn't articulate it at the time. In interviews conducted decades later, many of them expressed conflicted feelings about the battle. Pride in having performed their duty effectively, horror at the sheer scale of killing they'd participated in, respect for the courage of their enemies, and a lingering question about whether war could ever be justified when it required such massive destruction of human life. One Marine, speaking at a reunion in the 1990s, put it this way: "We killed them by the hundreds that night, and we were right to do it. They would have killed us if they could. But don't ask me to be proud of it. Don't ask me to celebrate it. I did what my country asked me to do, what I had to do to survive and help my buddies survive. But there's no glory in killing, even when it's necessary. There's just the job, and getting it done, and living with what you've done for the rest of your life." The battle site on Guam remains largely unmarked today. Unlike famous battlefields such as Gettysburg or Normandy, there are no extensive monuments or museums commemorating what happened there. The valley where 800 Japanese soldiers died is just jungle again, peaceful and quiet, giving no hint of the violence that once erupted there. A few local historians know the story and occasionally lead tours to the site, but for most people on Guam, it's just another piece of jungle and an island full of World War II history. This anonymity is perhaps fitting. The ambush wasn't one of the war's famous battles, wasn't a turning point in the grand strategic sense. It was simply one engagement among thousands in the Pacific War, significant to the men who fought in it, and their families. But just a footnote in the broader narrative of the war. Yet it encapsulates so many of the themes that defined the Pacific War: the clash of cultures, the importance of intelligence, the devastating effectiveness of American firepower, the courage and tragedy of Japanese soldiers fighting a losing war. For the families of the Japanese soldiers who died in the ambush, closure has been difficult to find. Unlike American families, who usually receive detailed information about how and where their loved ones had died, Japanese families often received only the briefest notifications. The chaos of Japan's defeat and occupation meant that detailed military records were often lost or destroyed. Many families never learned the specific circumstances of their relatives' deaths, never knew exactly where they'd fallen or been buried. Some of the Japanese soldiers killed in the ambush were buried in mass graves near the battlefield by American forces tasked with battlefield cleanup. Others were buried by surviving Japanese soldiers before they retreated or were captured. Still others were never buried at all. Their bodies left where they fell until tropical decay erased all traces. After the war, Japanese recovery teams visited Guam and other Pacific battlefields, searching for remains to return to Japan for proper Buddhist funeral rites. They found some, but not all. Even today, remains are occasionally discovered in Guam's jungles, identified through forensic analysis, and returned to Japan for final rest. The ambush also highlighted the racial dimensions of the Pacific War, though this is an uncomfortable topic that wasn't widely discussed until decades after the war ended. American soldiers and Marines often held deeply racist views of Japanese people, viewing them as subhuman, as vermin to be exterminated rather than human beings, to be fought and respected. This racism made it easier to kill Japanese soldiers without remorse, but it also led to atrocities, to the killing of prisoners and wounded, to a dehumanization that scarred both the perpetrators and victims. Japanese military culture had its own brand of racism, viewing Americans and other Westerners as spiritually weak and racially inferior. This mutual racism intensified the brutality of the Pacific War, turning what might have been a conventional conflict into something darker and more vicious. The ambush on Guam, while a legitimate military operation, took place within this context of racial hatred. Some Marines who participated later admitted that they'd enjoyed killing Japanese soldiers in a way they wouldn't have enjoyed killing Germans or Italians, that the racial dimension had made the killing feel more acceptable, even satisfying. Confronting this ugly truth is important for understanding the full story of the Pacific War. The soldiers on both sides were products of their times, raised in cultures that taught racial superiority and encouraged hatred of the enemy. We can acknowledge their courage and sacrifice while also recognizing that they participated in a conflict poisoned by racism on all sides. The lessons of that war should include not just the tactical and strategic insights, but also a recognition of how racism and dehumanization make warfare even more brutal than it needs to be. As we reach the end of this story, it's worth reflecting on what the ambush on Guam tells us about war itself. It demonstrates that superior intelligence and preparation can overcome courage and determination. It shows that technological and industrial advantages matter enormously in modern warfare. It reveals the human cost of military operations, not just in death tolls, but in psychological trauma that lasts generations. And it reminds us that every war story, no matter how focused on tactics and strategy, is ultimately about individual human beings making choices, following orders, fighting and dying, and trying to survive. The 800 Japanese soldiers who died in that valley on Guam weren't just statistics. They were sons and brothers and fathers and husbands. They had favorite foods and childhood memories and dreams for the future. They laughed with their friends and wrote letters to their families and experienced fear and hope and all the emotions that make us human. They died in a few hours of concentrated violence, cut down by an enemy they never had a chance to fight effectively against, and the world moved on without them. The American Marines who killed them also weren't just statistics. They were young men, most barely out of their teens, who'd been given weapons and told to fight. They performed their duty with courage and skill, but many of them carried the psychological scars of that night for the rest of their lives. They'd participated in mass killing even though it was militarily necessary and morally justified in the context of the war. That participation changed them, left marks on their souls that never fully healed. This is what war does. It takes ordinary people and places them in extraordinary situations where they must kill or be killed. It demands courage and sacrifice and dedication to duty, and it leaves behind death and trauma and questions that can never be fully answered. Was the ambush on Guam necessary? Yes, in the context of the larger war. Did it save American lives by quickly defeating a major Japanese counterattack? Absolutely. Does that make it any less tragic that 800 men died in a few hours? No, it doesn't. The story of the ambush deserves to be remembered, not to glorify war or celebrate killing, but to understand the reality of what happened in the Pacific from 1941 to 1945. It was a war of incredible violence, fought across thousands of miles of ocean between forces with fundamentally different cultures and values. It was a war where intelligence and technology mattered as much as courage and determination. And it was a war where individual soldiers on both sides displayed remarkable bravery while participating in a conflict that killed millions and devastated entire nations. For those who fought in the Pacific War, whether American or Japanese, the memories never fully faded. The sounds of battle, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the sight of dead comrades and enemies, these things stayed with them. Many Pacific War veterans struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though in their time it was called shell shock or battle fatigue or simply wasn't acknowledged at all. They'd experienced things that no human being should have to experience, seen things that no one should have to see, done things that haunted them for decades. The Japanese veterans faced additional burdens. They'd fought for a cause that ended in total defeat and national humiliation. They'd been taught that death was preferable to surrender, yet they'd survived. They returned home to a Japan that was occupied, devastated, and struggling to come to terms with the consequences of its militaristic expansion. For many Japanese veterans, admitting they'd been prisoners of war or had survived when their units were destroyed brought shame rather than honor. This made their reintegration into post-war Japanese society extremely difficult. American veterans had an easier time, relatively speaking. They came home to a victorious nation that celebrated them as heroes. They received benefits through the GI Bill, helping many of them get education and housing they couldn't have afforded otherwise. But even with this support, many struggled. The transition from the intensity and purpose of combat to the mundane reality of civilian life was jarring. Veterans often felt that civilians couldn't understand what they'd been through, that there was an unbridgeable gap between those who'd fought and those who'd stayed home. The ambush on Guam was just one night and one battle on one island in a war that spanned years and continents. But for the men who fought there, it was the defining experience of their lives. It was the night when everything they'd trained for became real, when the abstract concept of combat became the concrete reality of killing and survival. It was a night they would never forget, no matter how many years passed, no matter how much they might wish they could forget. As we conclude this story, remember that history isn't just about dates and battles and strategic decisions. It's about people, real individuals who lived and fought and died in circumstances they often didn't choose and couldn't control. The ambush on Guam involved over 1,000 such individuals, caught up in a war between nations, fighting for causes they may or may not have fully understood, displaying courage and experiencing terror in equal measure. The Japanese soldiers who walked into that ambush weren't evil. They were soldiers following orders, fighting for their country as they understood their duty. The American Marines who killed them weren't bloodthirsty killers. They were soldiers defending their positions, protecting their brothers in arms, doing what they'd been trained and ordered to do. Both sides consisted of human beings placed in an inhuman situation, trying to survive while fulfilling their duties. This is the true story of the ambush on Guam in July 1944. It's a story of intelligence triumph and tactical success, but also a story of tragedy and waste. It's a story that demonstrates both the best and worst of human nature, courage and cruelty, loyalty and brutality, sacrifice and slaughter. It's a story that deserves to be told and remembered, not to celebrate war, but to understand it, to recognize its terrible human cost, and to hopefully learn from it. The valley on Guam where this happened is quiet now. The jungle has reclaimed the battlefield. The shell craters have filled in, the blood has washed away, and nature has erased the physical evidence of that terrible night. But the story remains, preserved in military records, in veteran testimonies, in historical accounts. It's a story of a few hours that changed hundreds of lives forever, a small chapter in the massive book of World War II, but a chapter worth reading, worth understanding, and worth remembering. For the 800 Japanese soldiers who died there, their story ended on that night in July 1944. For the American Marines who survived, the story continued, but was forever marked by that experience. And for us, looking back across 80 years of history, the story serves as a reminder of what war truly is. Not glorious adventure or noble crusade, but a terrible necessity that destroys lives, breaks bodies and spirits, and leaves scars that never fully heal. That's the real lesson of the ambush on Guam, and that's why this story, like all true war stories, is ultimately a story about the cost of human conflict and the price that ordinary people pay when nations go to war.